She stood on the deck of her small but sturdy boat as the morning sun cast a golden glow across the waves, her eyes scanning the horizon for the fishing lines she had set earlier in the day. Her hands moved with practiced ease, adjusting the ropes and checking the knots, each motion smooth and sure from years of living at sea. The gentle sound of the water lapping against the hull was the only music she needed out here. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of salt and distant rain clouds. Far beyond the reach of her vision, she had left behind the noise and demands of the land to find her own rhythm in the vast openness of the ocean. The rocking of the boat matched her heartbeat, steady and unhurried, a reminder that life could still be simple if one chose it to be. Her mornings usually followed the same pattern. She would rise with the first light brew, a pot of strong coffee over her small gas burner, and stand at the bow, watching the world wake up the sun, climbing slowly, the seabirds wheeling overhead, their cries sharp and clear. She knew every sound, every shift in the wind, every subtle change in the water. The ocean spoke in a language of ripples, currents, and colors, and she had learned to listen with patience and respect. This morning felt no different yet. In the back of her mind, there was a quiet tension, a whisper that the day might not unfold as smoothly as the others had. She moved to the stern and pulled in one of her lines. The catch was modest, but enough. For a meal later, she smiled faintly at the thought of cooking it in her small pan. The skin crisp, the meat tender. She had learned long ago how to make the most of little, and she wore that knowledge like armor. The sea had taught her to value resourcefulness, and to rely on herself above all else. When storms came, she faced them head-on. When the nights grew long, she kept the lantern burning, and when loneliness crept in, she would look up at the stars and remember that even in the middle of nowhere, she was never truly alone. The boat itself was her pride and companion, a vessel she had repaired with her own hands, replacing planks, sealing leaks, repainting the hull until it gleamed white against the blue of the water. Every scratch and dent told a story. Every rope and sail carried the memory of winds and journeys past. She trusted the boat as much as she trusted herself, for both had endured challenges that might have broken something less determined. She had weathered tempests and days, when the sea turned dark and angry, when waves rose like walls, and rain battered her until she could barely see. Yet each time she came through with the same quiet resilience that had carried her through much of her life. She checked her compass. Though she had no pressing destination, just a general path toward the calmer waters she preferred to fish in. There was a map folded on the small table below deck, marked with circles and notes, a log of where she had been and what she had seen. She often thought of the boat not as a means to travel from one place to another, but as a way to live in the in-between, to exist in that space where the rules of the shore no longer applied, where the only law was the tide and the only schedule was the rising and setting of the sun. A gull landed briefly on the railing, eyeing her with the bold curiosity of a creature unafraid of humans. She tossed it a scrap of bread from her breakfast and watched it take off again, wings flashing in the sunlight. She felt the warmth on her face, the wind brushing against her hair, the slight creak of the boards underfoot. It was the kind of peace she had fought hard to find, and she guarded it fiercely, never allowing anyone to disturb the balance she had created. Yet as she stood there sipping the last of her coffee, she noticed something unusual. The faintest vibration under the deck, a low hum that did not belong to the sea or the wind. It grew steadily louder, and she turned her head, scanning the horizon with narrowed eyes. At first there was nothing, only the shimmer of heat rising from the surface of the water. But then a shape began to form in the distance, gray and purposeful, moving toward her position with steady determination. She set her mug down on the railing, her fingers tightening slightly on the metal as she watched the vessel approach, a flicker of unease passing through her chest. The ocean was wide and empty, and chance encounters were rare. But this was no fishing boat, no friendly traveler. This was something else entirely. The distant hum became a steady growl as the gray vessel pushed through the water, cutting a sharp line toward her boat, its shape growing larger with each passing minute until there was no mistaking the markings along its hull. This was a coast guardship moving with clear intent and discipline, the kind that never wandered without a reason. She remained at the stern, her gaze fixed on the approaching craft. The sunlight glinting off its metal surface, she could see the crew moving on deck. Their figures sharp against the bright sky, even at a distance, she could sense the precision in their movements, the way they stood and scanned the sea as if every detail mattered. Her mind began to work quickly, running through possibilities. She had no illegal cargo, no violations. She knew of her papers were in order and her fishing was well within the permitted zones. Yet the approach of the Coast Guard was never casual. They came with authority and purpose, and rarely for a friendly chat. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to remain calm. Her posture relaxed, but her senses sharp as she adjusted the ropes and secured loose gear. The habit of preparation deeply ingrained from years at sea and years before that in an entirely different world. The engines roared louder as the Coast Guard vessel drew close enough for her to see the expressions on the faces of the crew. There was focus there, but also a certain readiness that put her on alert. One man stood at the bow, a loudspeaker in hand, his voice carrying across the water as he ordered her to hold position and prepare for boarding. The words were clear and firm, without hostility, yet backed with the kind of authority that did not invite argument. She gave a small nod, her face unreadable as she guided her boat into a steady idle, letting the waves carry it gently in place. Two figures moved with practiced speed, stepping off their vessel and onto hers in a single fluid motion, their boots striking the deck with a hollow thud. They wore the standard dark uniforms of the service with utility belts and radios, their eyes already scanning her boat, noting the layout, the equipment, the signs of recent activity. One greeted her briefly, the tone polite but official before. Requesting her identification and vessel registration, she handed the documents over without hesitation, her movements deliberate and calm, her eyes meeting theirs without flinching. She had learned long ago that control began with presence, and she intended to hold it. The officers began their inspection, moving across the deck in opposite directions, one checking the fishing gear and storage compartments, while the other examined the navigation equipment and logbook. They spoke in low-clipped tones into their radios, confirming details with unseen voices. Their manner was efficient, precise, like a clock ticking toward a predetermined moment. She followed their movements, casually leaning against the railing as though their presence was little more than a passing inconvenience. But inside her mind, every sense was awake and listening. After a few minutes, the first officer returned the papers to her. Yet his tone had shifted subtly. He explained that they had been instructed to detain the vessel pending an investigation into a matter involving unidentified craft in the area. She listened without interruption, the slight roll of the sea rocking them gently as his words hung in the air. She asked what the specific accusation was, but he replied that the details were not his to share, only that orders had been issued, and they were to secure the boat for further review. There was a pause in which the only sound was the creak of the ropes and the low hum of the engines from the larger vessel. The officers began marking certain areas of her boat with colored tape, small bright tags against the weathered surfaces. They photographed her equipment, her navigation charts, even the personal items near the helm, all with the same calm precision. She did not move to stop them, nor did she speak, her silence deliberate, allowing them to believe they were in control while she quietly measured every move they made. It was then that the second officer, while crouching near the helm, noticed something out of place, a small black waterproof case tucked neatly beneath the bench, its edges worn from years of handling yet still intact. He pulled it into the open, his brow furrowing slightly as he examined it without opening. He called for his partner, who stepped over and knelt beside him. Their quiet exchange almost lost under the sound of the waves. She watched without expression. though inside she knew that whatever happened next would decide the course of this encounter and perhaps the freedom she had fought so hard to preserve. The officer holding the small black waterproof case turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of it as though the contents might tell him a story without the need to open it. The other officer watched closely, his eyes narrowing as if he sensed that this object was somehow more important than it appeared. They exchanged a brief glance, one of those silent communications between people who have worked together long enough to read the unspoken signals between them. The first officer unclipped the latches with a quick practiced motion, and the lid lifted on stiff hinges, revealing what lay inside. Beneath the thin layer of foam sat a single laminated identification card, its edges slightly worn from use, but still clean and legible. The bold, military insignia at the top caught the light unmistakable, even to someone who had never served below the emblem. In crisp block letters were the words, Special Forces, and just beneath that, the name and photograph of the woman standing before them. The photo was not recent. Her hair shorter, her expression sharper, but the eyes were the same calm and steady, with a hint of something that no uniform could fully conceal. For a moment, neither officer spoke. They simply stared at the card as if trying to reconcile the quiet, solitary figure before them with the weight of the title printed in clear letters. The sea rocked gently underfoot, but the air between them had shifted. The first officer set the case down carefully, as though it might shatter. If handled without respect, he asked her where she had gotten it, his tone softer now, stripped of the earlier authority. She met his gaze without blinking and replied that it was hers, earned and carried for reasons she was not at liberty to discuss. Second officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking toward their vessel as if considering what to say into his radio. He hesitated before speaking, finally asking if she was still active. She gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile and told him that some things never truly end. Even when the paperwork says otherwise, her voice was calm, but carried an edge that made it clear she had nothing to prove to them. And yet everything she said was a quiet assertion of who she was and what she was capable of. The first officer radioed in his voice lower than before. He relayed what they had found. And there was a long pause on the other end, so long that the steady rhythm of the waves seemed louder in its absence. Finally, the reply came short and clipped, but it was enough to change the course of their actions. Whatever authority had sent them here had just shifted its stance. They were to stand down. The tension in the air eased slightly, though the officers still moved with caution as, if unsure what other surprises this day might hold, one of them stepped back toward the helm, glancing at the equipment they had photographed and the tape they had placed earlier. Without a word, he began peeling the tags away, returning the boat to its untouched state. The other officer closed the case gently and handed it back to her. She took it with steady hands, her eyes on them, but her mind already moving ahead, calculating what this encounter meant and how far the reach of her past might still extend into her present life. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the faint scent of salt and distant rain. The Coast Guard vessel loomed nearby, its crew still watching, though their postures had changed from readiness to something closer. To curiosity, she could almost feel their unasked questions drifting across the water, wondering who she was and what she had done to make their own officers pause in the middle of a routine operation. She offered no explanations, the silence between them serving as its own answer. The officers seemed eager now to conclude their visit. They exchanged a few brief words between themselves, confirming that there was nothing further to inspect or seize. One of them made a final note in a small waterproof pad before tucking it away. They both thanked her, their tones polite and perhaps even a shade respectful, though neither said outright what they were thinking. She simply nodded, offering no more than that as they stepped back toward the edge of her deck, preparing to return to their vessel. Before leaving, the first officer looked back at her one last time. his expression unreadable but his eyes lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. Then, with a quick step, he was gone, leaping. Across the gap to the other ship, the engines of the Coast Guard vessel rumbled to life once more, and slowly it began to turn away the distance between them, widening with each roll of the waves, until the gray hull was little more than a fading shape on the horizon. She remained where she was, the case, still in her hand, feeling the familiar weight of it. The same weight she had carried for years, a reminder of things she had done and the people she had been. She slid it back under the bench, securing it once more as the sea stretched out before her, endless and open. Her gaze settled on the horizon, calm returning like the tide, but the memory of the encounter lingering like the shadow of a storm that had passed, but could always return. The Coast Guard vessel had faded from sight, but the air still felt charged, as though the encounter had left an invisible mark on the open water. She remained at the helm for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the horizon, the gentle roll of the waves, almost lulling her back into the rhythm she knew so well. Yet her mind was far from calm. She could still picture the expressions on the officers' faces when they opened the case. The flicker of recognition, the subtle shift from command to caution. It was a look she had seen before, though in far different circumstances, and it always meant the same thing. They understood she was not simply another civilian adrift in the sea. She moved slowly across the deck, checking the ropes, the lines, the state of the gear. Not because it was needed, but because it gave her hands something to do. The motions steadying her thoughts, the ocean stretched out endlessly around her, the sunlight breaking across its surface in shifting patterns of silver, and blue, each glint a reminder of how small her vessel was against the vastness. Yet she had never felt vulnerable out here. In fact, it was on land that the world seemed more dangerous, full of questions, eyes that lingered too long, and the weight of a past that some might not forgive if they truly knew it. The case had not been opened in years, and even now she felt a strange unease at the thought of it sitting beneath the bench visible to others. Its presence was meant to be quiet, private, and carried only as a safeguard, not as an introduction. She thought of the times it had traveled with her through jungles, across deserts, on the decks of ships, and in the belly of aircraft, far from any official port. It had never been questioned. In those days, because those around her already knew who she was and why she was there, it had been proof only to those who had never fought beside her. She recalled the first time she had been issued the identification, the weight of the laminated card in her hand, the officer who had handed it to her speaking in that low-clipped tone that carried both pride and warning. "You carry this not for yourself, but for the mission and for those who will not return." She had nodded back then, too young to fully understand that the real meaning of those words would only settle years later when the missions were over and the people were gone and the card was just a small piece of plastic holding ghosts. The officers today had seen the emblem and the title, but they had not seen the years behind it. The training that pushed her past the limits of the body, the nights where the cold cut through bone, the days where the air was so hot it burned the lungs. They had not seen the faces of those she had left behind or the ones she had saved. They could not know how each moment on the sea now was a deliberate choice. A life she had carved out of silence and salt water because it was the only place where the noise of the past could not reach her fully. She took the case out again, turning it over in her hands, the sun glinting off the smooth surface. It was strange how something so small could hold such weight. She opened it briefly, not to show anyone, but simply to remind herself of what was inside the card. Still there, the same as it had been the day she had placed it inside. She closed the lid again, with care returning it to its place under the bench, hidden from view, her gaze lifting once more to the open sea. The wind shifted, bringing with it the faint smell of rain, and she adjusted the sails to catch the breeze. The boat responded instantly, its movement through the water smooth and sure. She could feel the tension easing from her shoulders as the horizon opened before her, wide and endless. The sea had always been her escape, her sanctuary. Yet she knew it could never truly erase the life she had lived. It could only give her space to exist without answering to anyone. As the clouds gathered in the distance, she thought of the officers returning to their base, perhaps speaking quietly among themselves about the woman alone on the boat with the Special Forces ID. She wondered if they would try to learn more, if they would search her name in whatever database they could access. But she also knew that some records were never meant to be found. Some names were locked away behind walls even. They could not breach. The rain was coming. She could smell it in the air, and she welcomed it. The sea would wash the deck, clean, and with it perhaps some of the residue left from the morning's encounter. The rain came in a slow, steady curtain, soft at first, and then heavier until each drop struck the deck with a muted rhythm that blended with the sound of the waves. She stood beneath the small overhang at the helm, the hood of her weather jacket. Pulled up, though the water still found its way to her face, it was a familiar sensation. The cool weight of it on her skin, the way it blurred the horizon into a hazy line between sky and sea. She had been in rains like this before, in places where the sound of it could mask the approach of footsteps or the turn of a lock, the kind of places where you moved quickly and spoke little. Her thoughts drifted not because she wanted them to, but because the mind was a tide that often returned to the same hidden shores. She remembered a night far from here in a port city, where the streets were narrow and the lights dim. The rain had fallen then too, soaking through the fabric of her clothes and pooling in the uneven stones underfoot. She had moved through the shadows with a purpose, her pack light, but containing more than enough to complete what she had been sent to do. There had been no room for hesitation, no space for second guesses, only the steady forward momentum toward the point of contact. The face of the contact came to her, now sharp against the blur of memory, a man with eyes that never settled on one thing for long, his voice low and deliberate as he handed over the small black case that even now sat under the bench. On her boat, it had been the first time she carried it, and the weight had felt different, then heavier somehow, because it was not just a sign of who she was, but a key to where she could go and what she could do. Without question, she had taken it. Without a word, tucking it close and disappearing into the wet streets before anyone could mark her presence. The mission had been swift, precise, and silent, the kind that left no trace and no story for those who were not there to tell it. She had returned to the extraction point long before dawn, the rain still falling, the city lights reflecting off the wet surfaces in shards of yellow and red. When she boarded the transport, she had not spoken to anyone, not even to the others who were there. The silence had been mutual, each person lost in their own thoughts, perhaps replaying the moments or perhaps willing themselves not to think of them at all. Now on the open sea, years later, she could still feel the way the rain that night had soaked her hair and run down her spine, mingling with the thrum of adrenaline in her veins. It was strange how the body remembered. Even when the mind tried to bury the details, she looked out at the gray horizon, watching as the line of clouds shifted and broke in places, revealing pale streaks of light. It reminded her that no storm lasted forever, even if its memory lingered long after the skies cleared. She moved to the bench and pulled the case out again, the rain spotting its surface. She set it on her lap for a moment, running her fingers along the edges. It was more than just an identification. It was a link to every step she had taken since that first night. Every mission, every departure and return, every decision that had led her to choose the sea as her refuge. She did not regret carrying it, though she knew it had the power to change how others saw her, as it had with the officers that morning. She had long since accepted that some things could never truly be left behind. They could only be carried differently. The rain began to ease, the drops growing lighter until they became little more than a mist clinging to the air. She closed the case and slid it back beneath the bench. feeling the familiar sense of control settle in her chest. She took hold of the wheel, adjusting the course toward calmer waters, the waves breaking gently against the hull. She breathed in deeply, filling her lungs with the scent of salt and rain. The sea was once again hers alone, the horizon, stretching, ahead wide and open, offering the kind of space where she could move without orders, without deadlines, without anything but the pull of the tide and the will to keep going. The afternoon passed quietly, the storm clouds thinning into streaks of pale gray against the soft blue of the sky. The sea had calmed, and the steady rocking of the boat felt almost like breathing, each rise and fall slow, and even she moved about, the deck checking the gear, drying the ropes, and making sure the small solar panel was angled toward the light. The work was routine, yet grounding a way to keep the mind in the present, where the only concerns were wind and water. She had almost convinced herself that the encounter with the Coast Guard was behind her, when a sound reached her ears, faint but out of place against the steady rhythm of the waves. It was low at first, barely more than a murmur, but as she stilled her movements, she could hear it more clearly, a mechanical hum carrying across the open water. She turned slowly, scanning the horizon, her eyes narrowing against the glare of the sun. There was nothing at first, just the rolling expanse of sea. Then a dark speck appeared far to the east, small but moving with purpose, its wake slicing the surface cleanly. She studied it for a long moment, her instincts already cataloging details, the angle of approach, the speed, the way it rode the water, each detail layering into the unshakable truth that this was no fishing boat and no casual traveler. She adjusted her course slightly, not enough to appear evasive, but enough to give herself more space should she need it. The wind caught the sail, and the boat responded, obediently gliding forward at a steady pace. Her hands rested on the wheel, her posture relaxed, but her eyes never leaving the distant vessel. Memories stirred at the edge of her thoughts. Memories of times when a distant shape on the horizon had meant something far more dangerous than a passing stranger. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the sharpening of focus that came before decisions had to be made. The approaching boat grew larger, its details sharpening until she could make out the sleek dark hull and the low cabin built for speed rather than comfort. There were no visible markings, no flags, no numbers along the side. Its windows reflected the sun like mirrored eyes, hiding whatever watched from within. She knew enough about boats to recognize this one as something that could overtake hers with little effort if it chose to. Her own vessel was built for endurance, not speed, a deliberate choice when she had decided to live at sea, but one that came with its own vulnerabilities. She considered her options, running through them in the quiet of her mind. She could alter course more drastically, heading toward a chain of small rocky islands to the north, where shallow waters might deter pursuit, or she could maintain her heading and wait to see if the other vessel changed direction. A third option remained unspoken, the one that relied on skills she rarely needed anymore, but had never truly forgotten. She had no weapons on board, at least none visible. Yet the sea offered its own tools if one knew how to use them. The boat behind her was closer now, close enough for her to see the shape of two figures standing near the bow, their bodies swaying slightly with the motion of the water they were watching. She could feel it even across the distance. She kept her face neutral, her movements unhurried as she adjusted the lines on the sail, her eyes catching every shift in their course, every rise and fall of their hull. She knew that sometimes the smallest tells could reveal intent, a fraction too much speed, a shift in angle, a signal sent unseen. The wind freshened, carrying the scent of open water, and she used it to gain a little more distance, her boat leaning into the breeze with a gentle creak, the sound familiar and steady. The other vessel matched her pace without closing further, which was almost more unsettling than if it had tried to overtake her. It meant they were waiting, watching, deciding she had been on both sides of that moment before and knew how quickly it could turn. She kept her gaze on the horizon ahead, where the water shimmered and the sky curved downward into the unknown. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long streaks of light across the waves. The world looked peaceful, yet every part of her remained coiled and ready. The case beneath the bench was still there, silent and heavy, its presence a reminder that some things once revealed could not be taken back. She would not be the first to break the silence between the two boats. She would wait and watch, because in the space between action and reaction, the one who held still the longest often held the advantage. The sun hung lower now, casting the sea in bands of golden shadow as the mysterious vessel closed the gap inch by inch. It had kept its distance for what felt like hours, matching her pace with unnerving precision, yet now its bow began to angle. Slightly cutting through the waves toward her position, she stood at the helm, one hand steady on the wheel, her other resting loosely on the railing, her posture calm, though every muscle in her body was prepared for movement. The wind brushed strands of hair across her face, the scent of salt sharper now, as the air cooled with the coming evening. She watched the boat draw near the dark hull glistening with spray as water broke cleanly against it. The figures on the bow were clearer now. 2 men, both standing with the easy balance of those accustomed to the sea. They wore no uniforms, no insignia, no markings that might reveal allegiance or purpose. Their eyes hidden behind mirrored lenses, their bodies still as they approached, neither raising a hand in greeting nor signaling their intentions. She had seen such stillness before, the kind that came before decisive action. The hum of their engine deepened as they slowed their speed, bringing their vessel alongside hers at a respectful distance, yet close enough for their voices to carry. One of the men called out, asking if she needed assistance. His tone polite, yet measured as though each word had been weighed before leaving his mouth. She gave the smallest shake of her head her reply. Simple and without invitation, she was fine and her boat was in perfect working order. There was no reason for them to be here. They did not leave, instead they maintained their position. The second man moving toward the stern of their boat, scanning her deck with a gaze that lingered on certain points. The helm, the navigation equipment, the bench near the rail. She kept her expression neutral, though she was keenly aware of his interest in that specific area. The black case beneath the bench felt heavier than usual, though it remained hidden from sight. She shifted her stance, slightly blocking his line of view without making the movement obvious. The first man spoke again this time, asking where she was headed, his tone still casual, but with a thread of intent woven through it. She offered a vague answer, pointing toward the open horizon and mentioning a fishing run. Nothing that suggested she had any destination of consequence, nothing that might warrant further pursuit. Yet, she knew well enough that vague answers sometimes piqued more curiosity than direct ones, and their silence in response confirmed her suspicion. The minutes stretched on the only sounds, the slap of waves against the hulls and the low rumble of their idling engine. She thought of the Coast Guard earlier in the day, of the quick shift in their behavior after seeing her identification, and she wondered if word of that encounter had reached these men. Perhaps they were curious. Perhaps they were more than that. The sea had its own channels of information, and not all of them were official. She decided to turn slightly, adjusting her heading toward a line of rocky outcrops in the distance, their jagged shapes breaking the smooth curve of the horizon. The maneuver was subtle enough not to signal flight, yet purposeful enough to test their intentions if they followed. She would know that this was no chance meeting. The wind caught her sail, and the boat leaned into the motion, gliding smoothly. Across the water, the other vessel mirrored her course almost immediately. Her pulse steadied even as her mind calculated distances and possibilities. She could reach the outcrops before dark if the wind held there. The waters grew unpredictable with shifting currents and hidden shoals. She had navigated them before and knew where the channels ran tight, but a less familiar boat might hesitate to follow closely. It was not an escape exactly, but it was an advantage, one she could use if necessary. The Two men still had not offered names nor any real explanation for their presence. Their silence was becoming its own form of communication, telling her they were here for a reason that had nothing to do with helping a lone sailor. She kept her gaze fixed ahead as the gap between the boats narrowed slightly, the air thick with the weight of whatever was about to happen. The sea stretched out before them, wide and open, yet in that moment it felt as though the world had shrunk to the space between her deck and theirs. The rocky outcrops drew closer, the jagged silhouettes rising from the water like the bones of some ancient creature, their dark shapes breaking the soft glow of the setting sun. She held her course steady, the wheel firm beneath her hands, the air cooler now, carrying the sharp scent of seaweed from the shallows ahead behind, and to the side the other vessel kept pace, its low hum constant, its bow lifting and falling with the swell, the two men still watching, still silent though the weight of their attention felt heavier than the water pressing against the hull. She guided her boat toward a narrow channel between two of the larger rocks. The current here was tricky, with unseen eddies that could push a vessel off course. She knew how to ride them, using their pull to slip through cleanly, but an unfamiliar pilot might find the wheel fighting against them. The sound of the water grew louder as waves broke against stone, sending sprays of white upward like smoke. She glanced briefly toward the other vessel, noting that it had slowed slightly as if gauging whether to follow her into the passage. One of the men finally moved toward the edge of their deck. His voice raised just enough to carry over the water. He asked her to stop and talk, the words framed as a request, yet leaving little room for refusal. She did not answer immediately, her gaze fixed on the gap ahead, the water there surging and curling like the breath of something alive. The man spoke again, this time adding that it was important. She paused, then let her voice carry back across the distance, telling him that whatever was important to him was not important to her. The silence that followed was long enough for the cry of a seabird to cut through it, sharp and fleeting. The other man stepped forward, now joining his partner, his voice lower but sharper, asking directly if she had been visited by the Coast Guard earlier in the day. Her hands tightened slightly on the wheel, though she kept her face unreadable. She told him that she had, and that they had left without issue. The men exchanged a look, small but not lost on her. She knew then that this was no coincidence. They had known before they ever reached her. The bow of their vessel angled slightly as if to block her path, but she held her course, threading her way toward the channel, the rocks rising higher on either side, the water churning between them. The narrowness forced the other boat to hang back, unwilling to risk closing the distance. Here she took advantage of the space, letting the current pull her through with practiced ease, the hull brushing close enough to the stone that she could hear the low grinding of water against rock. Once she was through, she turned slightly into open water. Again, the rocks now a barrier between them. She glanced over her shoulder, the other vessel still hovering at the mouth of the passage, its figures small against the shadowed backdrop of stone. One of them called out again this time, his tone carrying frustration, telling her that they only wanted to ask questions. She did not answer. She simply adjusted her sail to catch the last of the evening breeze, the boat leaning into the wind, the bow cutting cleanly through the calmer water ahead. The case under the bench seemed to hum in her awareness, though it remained untouched, its presence like a silent companion reminding her that she carried more than just her own history. She carried connections to things these men might suspect, but would never truly know. The sun dipped lower, painting the horizon in shades of red and gold, the light stretching across the sea, like a path she alone was meant to follow. She kept her eyes on it, her mind already settling back into the rhythm of the ocean, where the rules were her own, and the silence was hers to keep. The other vessel did not follow her through the rocks. Whether by choice or by caution, she could not say, but its shape grew smaller in the fading light, until it was only a shadow against the line of stone. She felt the tension in her shoulders loosen, though not entirely. She knew enough to understand that this might not be the last time she saw them. The sea had a way of bringing people back together, whether they wished it or not. Still, for now, the water ahead was clear and the night was hers. She adjusted her heading, letting the wind and current guide her deeper into the open expanse, her boat moving steady and sure into the vast quiet beyond.